Generative AI transparency, state and federal approaches. On our panelists, we have Zach Boyd of the Utah Office of AI, Anne Romatowski from CFPB, Robert Savold, chair of the fintech group at McGlinchey, Kirk Collimore, state senator of Utah, and then this will be moderated by the general counsel of Spring Labs, Nate Schmidt. Let's give everybody a round of applause.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you all for being here today. Most importantly, I want to thank the four panelists. I want to thank the sponsors. Without all of you here, we would have no panel, so really appreciate the attendance here today. My name is Nate Schmidt. I'm the general counsel of Spring Labs. And this afternoon, we have an amazing panel that I'm really excited about. It's generative AI transparency, state and federal legislative approaches, and really for subject matter expertise. Before we get started, I know Johnny did this earlier, but I want to see, with a show of hands, how many of you implemented AI in your everyday workflow 12 to 18 months ago? 1, 2, 3, about 3 hands. How many do you think that you will implement generative AI or some form of AI in your everyday workflow 12 to 18 months from now? All right, so a few more hands. Okay, thank you for that. All right, so the purpose of this panel is to hopefully give you some information that you can take back with you on how you can handle the regulatory requirements as you implement AI in your everyday work life. Just to give you a little overview of the format, I'm going to let each of these panelists introduce themselves, then I'm going to ask some questions, and I actually think that we're going to give 5 or 10 minutes for some audience Q&A if there's interest there. Does that sound okay? All right, let's get started. Robert, do you want to start with your introduction?
Sure, I'll start off. I'm Robert Savoy. I'm the chair of the fintech practice at McGlinchey Stafford.
And I'm Anne Romatowski. I'm with the CFPB. I lead our market monitoring work for AI and machine learning, and also lead the algorithmic decision-making work out of our technologist program.
I'm Kirk Collimore. I'm in the Utah State Senate and have been dabbling in AI policy for a couple years now.
I'm Zach Boyd, director of the new Utah Office of AI Policy and a mathematics professor at BYU.
Awesome. Thank you for those intros, and let's get this panel going. The current regulatory landscape is evolving rapidly. There's really no comprehensive federal AI regulatory landscape. There's basically a patchwork with different regulatory agencies that not directly impact AI, but they do indirectly. Robert, I want to start with you. How do you view the current legislative and regulatory framework in the U.S., and how does the lack of a comprehensive federal AI regulatory framework impact your clients today?
Sure. I'll take a minute and go through that. I mean, when you think about AI in context of financial services, particularly, I think there's sort of 2 broader categories. First, you have longstanding federal and state law that apply and govern financial services that are generally tailored to the businesses that the companies are in, payments, deposits, consumer credit, lending, and those arise when AI is going to do something in that regulated space. So, we'll talk a little bit about, adverse action notices and underwriting, which was, for me, about 8 years ago or so, the original use case for AI when we started to look at, well, what does that mean if you're going to use an AI underwriting system, and how do you respond to that under existing federal law that regulates the activity, but it's more about the activity itself and how you use AI rather than AI itself. And then I think the second broader category is AI-specific legislation, right? You think about California passed a law that requires disclosure of AI bots when you're speaking to them. And so when we work with clients rolling out AI technology, saying, hey, we're going to use AI to do customer service calls for loan servicing or something like that, now you have to deal with, A, the laws that already existed that regulated loan servicing, but B, you have to deal with now what are the disclosures and how do you disclose if you have a live AI customer service representative that's actually speaking to consumers consumers? And then how do you handle the fact that now there's a requirement to disclose that you have that AI customer service representative? So I sort of break down those laws into two camps, and I think the challenges are slightly different, which is on the one hand, you have how do you deal with AI in a way that lets you successfully deploy AI and take account for and comply with these existing frameworks. And then I think the second one is more interesting right now, because how are the laws that are coming in to regulate AI specifically going to impact both AI in terms of its rollout across industries, but in financial services, how do you mesh that with what is typically a pretty robust set of regulatory requirements? And I think that the challenges are, in some level, a state-specific breakdown of what you have to do based on residency of your consumer, and then in some degree, are things going to be adopted that, because the AI has to be deployed at an enterprise-wide level, functionally delays or slows down or derails the deployment of AI. So those are, I think, the primary challenges that at least we see that we work with clients to try to resolve in the deployments that are going on now.
Thank you for that detailed explanation. And I'm going to kick it over to you. The CFPB has typically been focused on transparency and fairness, but I don't think I've seen anything substantive out of the CFPB that directly and comprehensively regulates AI development. What is your take on the current stance of the CFPB?
Sure. Well, first I will throw in my classic disclaimer. My comments do not constitute legal interpretation, guidance, or advice of the CFPB. My comments are my opinion and not those on behalf of the Bureau. So now that that's out of the way, the CFPB is really focused on bright lines. We think that bright line policies and rules make for a more fair and competitive marketplace that ultimately benefits consumers. And for that reason, we've really been focused on emphasizing to industry that the existing laws that are in place apply to firms regardless of what technology they're using. So laws like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, for example, have been regulating algorithms for decades now. And so firms that may choose to upgrade or upgrade their models, deploy machine learning or AI models are still subject to the same regulatory and legal expectations that they were when they were using logistic regressions, for example. So about a year and a half ago, the CFPB joined together with some of our other federal regulatory agencies, including the FTC, the EEOC, the DOJ, Office of Civil Rights, to put out a statement really saying that sort of advances in technology, or regardless of what technology is being used, we expect firms to comply with the law. And we've gotten a little bit more detailed on that for a few use cases. We've put out 2 circulars in the past year and a half or so about the use of adverse action notices, which Rob mentioned, really sort of reminding firms that the technology that they use is up to them, but we expect them to comply with the requirements to provide adverse action notices, regardless of what that technology is. And so if a firm, for example, wants to use an AI model, that they're not going to be able to explain a specific and accurate reason to a consumer why they might have been declined for a loan, that they should take that into account, take it into account that we expect them to comply with the existing sort of legal and regulatory regime.
Thank you, Ann. Senator, you were the sponsor of SB 149, which became the Utah AI Policy Act, which was, I believe, the first far-reaching comprehensive AI legislation in the United States. With your experience and knowledge, how do you view the current regulatory backdrop and the lack of a federal overreaching legislation?
Yeah, well, I think, and Robert alluded to this, but when it comes to technology issues, government has always been reactionary, and if at all, right? And when you look at like data privacy, for example, The federal government probably should have acted on this years ago, and yet we still don't have any comprehensive legislation at the federal level. And so what you're seeing is a patchwork of laws throughout the United States. I think we passed a consumer data privacy bill 2 years ago, and we were the 4th or 5th state to pass one. And so you're seeing this kind of patchwork of bills across the country. And the idea is, hopefully, states like Utah want to look for the lowest common denominator. We don't want to be over-regulatory. We want to find who's doing it the worst, if you will, and not do it as bad as that, And so, we're seeing that with social media now as well. We haven't seen Congress act in addressing the ills of social media, and so you're seeing states have to lead out on that. Utah led out on that as well. And there are states that are following behind. And so I think the same is going to be true for AI. My concern is that because it delves into so many various parts of our economy, that you're going to see the administrative bodies at work in developing regulations outside of Congress's purview or any laws that are passed. And they might even do it out of necessity, but that makes it very difficult for businesses in compliance. That makes it difficult for states when looking at regulatory reform or what they should do at a state level. And so I think by states leading out and passing these types of bills, the idea is hopefully we kind of set like a groundwork of this is a good starting point, and this is what Congress should be looking at. If we get a critical mass of states that pass bills that are somewhat similar, then hopefully that's the legislation that's adopted, so we have more conformity across the country. But because of the lack of movement that we've seen in other technological spaces at Congress, I think it is important that the states lead out on this. And I'll touch just a little bit on what we did with our bill. We did some of the disclosure stuff that was mentioned. We said that any AI that interacts with consumers, there's got to be some disclosure requirements. And first we just said, an AI can't lie, right? If you're interacting and you ask, am I dealing with AI? It's got to be truthful, and it's got to affirm that you're dealing with AI. But then we said for certain types of more high-risk transactions, think medical or mental health or financial services, there's got to be an upfront disclosure. And we took a stab at that, and if I'm being completely honest, we probably went a little too broad, and we're not prescriptive enough. And so it could be interpreted that your disclosure at this point was not good enough. And so we're going to run a cleanup bill and hopefully clarify some of that so that businesses can have that assurity that they're complying with the law. And so we're working on that the next couple months. The other thing we did is created Zach's current job in the AI policy lab here in Utah. You've probably heard of regulatory sandboxes, and Utah led out on that years ago. We want to do the same thing, but when you create a regulatory sandbox, you kind of say, here's the regulations, or here's the laws that we're going to exempt, or we're going to minimize the penalties or something like that. But in AI, we couldn't do that because it was so comprehensive in all the areas that it touched. And so we said, what we'll do is we'll create a lab where businesses can come and tell us where you intend to use AI. And if the use of that AI is pushing the envelope, or you're working in the gray area a little bit, that we can enter into mitigation agreements with you and say, we like this, we think this would be useful, we think this would help consumers, we think this would help business here in Utah, and so we're willing to give you a shot at this here in Utah. We'll sign this mitigation agreement with you and allow you to be exempted from whatever laws, if it makes sense. It's got to make sense. We don't want to put people in harm, and that's Zach's job, is to figure out, does it make sense? And so these mitigation agreements will be unique to the businesses and the use cases that come and present them. But we think that would help spur innovation, spur development here in Utah, because it would give some assurance to those businesses that are pushing the envelope that they can do that here in Utah with some level of protection.
Thank you. Zach, one of your directives under your new role is to meet with businesses and try to figure out what kind of policies should be going forward. What are you hearing from, let's say, financial institutions? Are you hearing anything specific from financial institutions or other businesses, if none?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've met with just a really large number of stakeholders over the last 4 months that I've set up my office. And I've been just incredibly impressed at the diversity of applications, the creativity of them, and the diversity of needs. And I will say, the charge that I have from the legislature is to go through thematically and deal with policy areas that seem to have the most urgent needs right now. And so we're just nearing the end of our first deep dive, which is on the role of AI in mental health. There's a really compelling case for government action there, both on the protecting side and on the promoting innovation side, because we do need substantial innovation in our mental health system in the state. In terms of financial institutions generally, I've had pretty limited outreach from them. I'll say that the things that I've noticed there seems to be the biggest interest in, and people in the audience can approach me afterwards if there are others that I've missed, but I've noticed that there's a big interest for businesses writ large in clarifying liability. Right, like I've noticed a lot of business chilling seems to be happening when people just don't know what the rules are, what box their business needs to be in. They know there are rules somewhere, they just don't know exactly what they are. And then I have seen some concern about the role of bias in algorithms and whether the state is going to, have some kind of regulatory stance with respect to that. But I'll say, just coming from my perspective as a scientist, as someone who's been, an innovator in this space, not on the business side, but still, in the area of AI, I'm going to be kind of slow to clamp down to recommend that we, as the state, clamp down on nascent technologies that we really don't understand the scope and breadth of right now, because I've been in that space, so we want to make sure that we provide basic guardrails, but allow room for people to flourish and try creative things while the science around this matures and while we're able to, for example, come up with really reliable bias measures, or really understand, how to make sure we have the right liability incentives in place so that the responsible vendors can thrive and the irresponsible vendors are, disincentivized from entering spaces where there are significant outcomes if the wrong determinations are made.
I think that makes sense. Let me ask you this. So with the stakeholders that you meet with, do any of them complain about the fragmented patchwork regulations that they have to adhere to?
Some, yeah. I think there is a preference by a lot of people to have uniform federal regulation because it makes compliance easier. But our prediction is that this is probably not going to come very soon, given the election cycle and just kind of the general, sometimes sclerotic nature of the Congress. So we're basically building up a network with other states to try and introduce whatever uniformity we can to make sure that we're in sync with the ideas that others are dealing with. Of course, we're going to do it in the Utah way with the priorities that we have as a state.
Thank you. The Utah way. So, Senator Cullimore, look, you've been quoted as saying Utah prides itself on having a light touch in industry and innovation, and you want to promote innovation. Do you think there's risk with these other state laws that are not enacted yet, but there's legislation going through, like let's say the bill that was vetoed in California, which might be a little bit more restrictive than maybe what you have? Do you think there's any risk to having a dichotomy across state lines?
Yeah, definitely. It makes it very difficult to run multi-state businesses when you're dealing with different forms of regulation. But again, I think that's where I'll go back to consumer data privacy. There was big resistance in running that bill here in Utah until all of a sudden there wasn't. And all the businesses that were resisting it were all of a sudden saying, do you know what, actually, we do want something done in Utah because we think Utah will do it the right way, and that could be a model for other states. And so I think you're going to see, similar interest in AI policy, that they're going to look for the states that could do it the right way and probably promote it in those types of states. And again, try to seek that critical mass of states that are kind of doing like regulation, so that can bubble up to the federal level. Like Zach said, we're working with other states and trying to develop commonalities in our policy. The bill that we ran in Utah, we took to a legislative conference, a nationwide legislative conference, and it was approved as a model legislation for other states. And so other states are looking at Utah, and so yeah, I think it's important that the states act, because otherwise, sometimes not acting is just as bad for business and for the economy. When there's no certainty, there's a reluctance to move forward and to innovate. And so if we can provide the right framework where innovation can happen, then it allows for businesses to actually thrive in that circumstance.
Thank you. Robert, Ann, do you have anything to add before we move on to transparency?
I mean, I'll certainly jump in. If you're looking for uniformity amongst the states, just don't. That would be my piece of advice. I mean, there's been a lot of uniform laws that have passed over the years, and the states just play with them, right? I mean, even, you're talking about uniform laws from the 1970s and 80s, and states are passing legislation to tweak them and make them less uniform. I love the effort, right, to do that and to create good model legislation. And those privacy laws have probably been the best success of late because they are trying to have a common framework. And so I think having a state that can do a logical framework that gives those guardrails where companies can comply is a great thing to have a model where you don't have more reactive states driving the bus in terms of that. But it's a tough thing. And in financial services in particular, it's just been hard to reach a level of consistency and uniformity across the states. And that's even when, like the Conference State Bank supervisors are very involved. I'm on their industry development working group and work with a lot of the state agencies, on behalf of different clients. And they really try really hard to create uniformity, but it's tough, right? Because you have, I think y'all referenced, like Utah has to do it Utah's way with their policy that their people want to vote for and that their politicians want to do. And I think that's a challenge across state lines. And while you can do things to kind of keep the ship moving in the right direction, it's just hard to get that perfect uniformity. And I think if you're going to try to deploy AI, you have to be able to be agile and adjust to that, because there's going to be a level of variation even within common frameworks as to how you're going to be treated.
Thank you. And what are the primary concerns driving the need for transparency regulation around generative AI, particularly in financial services?
So we were actually chatting upstairs before this that transparency could mean 7 different things, depending on the context and who's asking the question. I wanted to focus a little bit on sort of explainability and interpretability. And I alluded to this in my sort of previous comment in the context of lending decisions and the responsibility of firms to provide accurate and specific reasons for adverse action notices when they decline a customer for a loan. I think that there's a long history in this country that has led up to the requirements for adverse action notices and for explainability in lending and other decisions. Unfortunately, systemic discrimination against protected groups, has created a model sort of starting from human decision makers and now moving into sort of algorithms and complex models making decisions that sort of leads us to where we are today. And I think it can be tempting to think that, once we moved away from sort of folks having to go into a branch to have a conversation with a lender who would really be able to make a subjective decision about whether or not to provide them with a loan, that now moving into a very data-driven approach has eliminated all that bias. But, all of us in this room know that, unfortunately, that's not true. And so I think everybody here also probably has the term garbage in, garbage out on their AI bingo card. I know I do. But as we think about sort of what's feeding those models, I think it's important to think about potential bias in, bias out. And so understanding why models are making the decisions that they are is important. And I think, if folks are interested, we can get nerdy on post-hoc explainability later. But as we think about transparency, sort of understanding the models themselves is important, but also understanding the data and where it comes from. And this is where sort of the topic of privacy that the senator brought up is really important as well. The CFPB has been doing a lot of work recently understanding the role of data brokers, and that's a key component in understanding AI and how it's being used in financial services. If AI models are trained or implemented using data that has been acquired illegally, there are very serious concerns there as well.
Thank you. Zach, do you want to jump in here on explainability in any capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wearing my scientist hat now as much as my regulator hat. I would say, explainability of AI models is still a very much open scientific research problem. There are lots of people who have their paradigms of explainability that say, try to express in words or through some other kind of metric, why the algorithm made the decision that it did. But, and I think, on the balance, often using these things is better than not using them, and it can put you in compliance with laws, which of course really matters. I will say, as a technical person, I'm quite skeptical that the reasons given are always the actual reasons, or that it's even meaningful to ask what the reason is. I mean, ultimately, the reason the algorithm did what it did is because of some combination of a billion different parameters that were learned in some obscure manner. But the same is also true of human decision makers, right? Humans make lots of decisions based off of vibes or other kind of complex ideas that they integrate. So I think caution is merited, but they are, I think most of these tools are perfectly fine to deploy as long as you take their output with a grain of salt.
Senator, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, can I just jump in? And so I don't have any technical understanding as Zach does, but my rudimentary understanding is that the LLMs, there's really only 4 or 5 major LLMs out there, and we made a conscious decision in Utah not to regulate the LLMs. Those are the large language models, which are really the basis for all the generative AI applications on top of that. And so what we're talking about is, there's 2 different forms of regulation. You can regulate the major LLMs, which we decided not to do because, one, it would discourage innovation of those LLMs here in Utah, even though none of them are being developed here in Utah right now. But rather looking at the applications on top of the LLMs, and so it's almost like 2 different regulations, And so whatever you build on top of that LLM is in the image generation, those are called LoRa's. I don't know what it'd be called in other types of applications, but you as a business have virtually no control over the LLM. Your control is how you use the information out of that LLM, and so we want to make sure that the regulation is right, that you're not being penalized for something that you had no control over, although you still have liability potentially for that output. And so what you need to do is make sure that your application on top of that LLM is spitting out the information that you expect it to. And so there needs to be regular audits. There needs to be regular review for compliance reasons, because we are kind of talking about 2 different things, if I explained that right, Zach.
Yep, I think that's right.
Thanks. Robert, let me kick this over to you. So what frameworks can institutions use, right, to make sure that their models are compliant?
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of go back to the 2 concepts that we talked about earlier. I mean, I'm full financial services compliance lawyer, full disclosure, and not legal advice, as Ann noted. And so, but what I'll note about that is if you're entering a regulated space, you have to deal with the regulations that apply, right? And so you have to confront those, like adverse action notices, right? They were the classic example that people looked at. And so, there's a focus of you need to understand the industry that you're getting into and what the laws are that apply, and you have to have a plan to resolve those. And that's where, you're the PhD, so you would be able to tell me about explainability, but, those models pivoted to a great degree to look to what are the adverse action notice requirements and how do you articulate those primary factors for a declination, and then pivoted also to sort of the quantitative analysis that you would do for fair lending and other testing, right? And so those are frameworks that, to your point, Ann, are longstanding. Those are not new things. They've existed, and so that's an obligation of, if you're in that space, you're subject to those regulations unless you get the law or the regulations changed, and you got to deploy your AI in a way that can account for those. And then I think the more interesting thing is, how are we in financial services particularly going to be impacted by AI, like generalized AI legislation? And that's an interesting thing to think about, because in some areas, like we talked about the privacy laws, right? The laws that have been going across, for the most part, those exclude transactions subject to the GLBA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley. So a lot of financial institutions are already subject to, again, another long-standing privacy law that is specific to financial institutions under that law. And so in some ways, that reduces the impact of those privacy laws, because there was already a heightened standard on financial institutions. What will be more interesting is I think you'll have that risk of very generalized regulation that's focused on a tech company that's nothing to do with financial services, right? You talked about the LLMs, and what would be really interesting to see is, does any of that legislation come in a way that captures financial services in a way that's sort of inconsistent with the way financial services operates? And I would meaningfully distinguish disclosure requirements like what you talked about, which generally can be accommodated, and financial services has a long history of consumer disclosure, and so you can generally find ways to fold that into your structure versus the more existential, now you can't use this, now you can't roll this out, or you have to disengage like vendor by vendor or operational system by system to sort of pull AI out. Like if you have version testing and modeling, and what do you do if you've already rolled it out based on current law? So I think those are the challenges that you see, and they present very different challenges.
Thank you. Senator, what role do partnerships between state regulators, federal agencies, and financial institutions play in setting industry-wide AI transparency standards?
Well, I mean, it's important to know what's going on around the country because, none of this is done in a vacuum. And it's like Robert said, we don't want to pass laws that are contradictory to regulations that are already being considered, already being applied and enforced. And so we have to have those ongoing conversations. And I think, again, I've mentioned this earlier, it's important to have ongoing conversations with other states and their regulators and their legislators, because I think that's what's going to help create some consistency in this.
Thanks. Zach, should the private sector be more proactive engaging with regulators and policymakers? And can you explain a little bit about Utah's regulatory sandbox that was created?
Yeah, I mean, I welcome all kinds of engagements from stakeholders. I would say some ways to engage, certainly through the regulatory sandbox. I mean, Senator Collmore can correct me if I'm wrong, but my vision at least is that, we want innovative ideas to be tried out first in Utah. We want Utahns to be able to experience the benefits of these technologies as rapidly as people can come up with convincing use cases and actually implement them to high quality. And the legislature has given us actually a very high degree in flexibility in finding ways to accommodate, requests for regulatory mitigation. In terms of other engagement, I mean, as has been highlighted multiple times across this panel, AI regulation is hard for numerous reasons, one of which is that it's a rapidly moving target, so you can't just regulate the technology as it is, because by the time the law is in place, the technology could be totally different and even likely will be totally different. And also, when you regulate a core technology that's at the foundation of many different industries, it's easy to get things wrong and misunderstand the use cases. So absolutely, my lab is going to try to be as open as possible in terms of our research process and the ideas that we're developing. And if we're going to, miss something that's important to your industry, either in blocking off things that would be reasonable to do, or in actually leaving a gap where bad actors can harm consumers, we're all ears about that kind of thing.
Thank you. And is there an avenue for financial institutions or AI vendors to work directly with the CFPB?
Yes, thank you. I was actually going to try to chime in to build off of Zach's comment. So the CFPB, I sit within the Office of Markets, which was mandated under Dodd-Frank to monitor consumer financial markets. My colleagues and I spend much of our day talking to folks in industry. We have an open door policy. Please feel free to reach out to me personally. My email address is ann.romatowski@cfpb.gov. The spelling's a little tricky, so it's on the screens if you need it. But reach out to me, and we'll set up time to talk with you or connect you with the right folks internally to have a conversation that, again, is sort of on the market monitoring side of the house, separate from our enforcement and supervision colleagues. Just a quick point on the topic of regulatory sandboxes. The CFPB has experimented with regulatory sandboxes in the past. And after a lot of careful consideration and examination of the program, we are no longer participating in regulatory sandboxes or other carve-outs like no action letters, which we used to, because we really found that first of all, they were potentially, giving firms permission to waive certain consumer protections against things like discrimination that were mandated by Congress. And then second, we also found that a lot of firms who were participating in these programs were marketing them as official endorsements from the CFPB, and that disrupted a competitive marketplace. And so again, to sort of ensure that all firms are on even footing and able to compete with each other and not have a leg up due to regulatory arbitrage, we decided to sunset that program. So just offering another perspective there.
Thanks, Dan. Robert, have you ever advised any companies on any participation in any regulatory sandboxes, and what's your experience with that?
Yeah, we've had a number of clients participate in sandboxes. I mean, I think the challenge is that you have to sort of have truly a novel product. You have to identify a regulatory challenge based on existing law, and then you have to be able to pilot it within a single state. We haven't really had companies want to consolidate multiple state sandboxes. So I think it has been useful, but it's more for early stage testing where, and I think this is part of the AI models, but where you want to be able to get live user testing, right, where you can go through and you do your best. And I mean, I think a lot of the tech companies outside of financial services do beta testing and different things where they'll disclose this is a in-process, whatever, software package, et cetera, and they're going to get feedback and improve. It's hard to do that in financial services, right? And so you have to find a place where, you don't have federal concerns. It's more of a state-specific issue for the most part, and that you can get a sandbox to go in and do user testing where you pick and you say, hey, we're going to go and do this in Utah. We're going to partner with the department. We're going to go do the sandbox, and then we're going to sort through this and see. And if there's no consumer harm, and if there's a way, to sort of build the product in that way, it informs future policymaking, and you can get authority to do that. I just think the tempering we've seen is that it's mostly useful for sort of early stage product testing where you are struggling with that tension between you can't roll out products on a broad basis if there's that uncertainty to such a degree, and then to sort of get that testing and then evaluate and iterate on the product from there. So we have seen companies use that. It's just mostly in that early stage. It's like giving beta testing to financial services industry is kind of what I think about what a sandbox does, whereas a tech company offering just a generic software product, they don't have the same regulations in just general business that financial services has.
Thank you. One more question before we open up the Q&A. Senator, I want to finish with you. Where do you see the evolution of AI regulation, say, a year from now? So much has happened in the last 12 to 18 months. I mean, do you expect similar changes in the next 12 months?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion, but I don't know that we're going to see a lot of coalescing around. I think we'll see coalescing around certain ideas, and things that need to be regulated, but I'm not sure the path forward on that. But some of the stuff is going to be data privacy within these LLMs or the applications on top of it. Like, how is that used? Where is this data going? Who has control of that? What's happening with that data? I think you're going to see, we've talked about explainability or transparency and decision making. I think you'll see some laws dealing with that in the various states and accountability for that. Something that Ann said earlier, I think is wholly appropriate and true, though, and something Utah did was pretty simplistic. It basically said laws and regulations already on the books still apply. Just because you use AI, you can't absolve yourself of that liability. And so we explicitly put that in state law, even though I don't think it was necessary, but I think the same will be, the same holds true for all states and probably federal regulation that, some of this we need to be careful that we don't need to do too much. There's already laws on the books, and we don't need to overcomplicate things and create more of a regulatory compliance issue. And so, but I think data privacy within AI and LLMs and transparency are probably two of the big next pushes.
Thank you for that perspective. So now we only have a few minutes left. Are there any questions in the audience? Please fire away. Not one? Oh, Johnny, we got one.
Hi, this is Suchitra. I'm from CBW Bank. My question is for Ann. You mentioned the 22 and the 23 guidance on the AANs for automated underwriting. is there like any clear standard on what constitutes a complex algorithm? Because a lot of that seems to be in the decision making of the examiner that you happen to get. Thank you.
So we've provided that guidance really with an intention to be tech agnostic and model agnostic. And so, the intention behind both of those circulars and also the statement that I mentioned before with the other federal regulators is really just to reinforce the notion that the laws in ACOA and Reg B to provide an accurate and specific reason are required. And so, it's really up to firms to decide what type of model they decide to use, as long as they can provide an accurate and specific reason. Does that answer? I feel like that might not answer your question, but I'm happy to chat with you later. I mean, regardless of model, we're model agnostic, so sort of the requirement stands regardless of what model firms choose to use.
Anyone else?
Hi there, Ashley Homafar, Product Counsel at Upgrade. I'm wondering if, from y'all's different perspectives, you could provide sort of a test or a rule of thumb for things that it's definitely okay for AI to make that decision, or definitely need to do some extra diligence or have some extra check in place before letting AI make that decision. It's a very easy question, obviously.
Who wants that?
Is that coming to me? Okay, that's coming to me. All right, outside counsel, always glad to take the questions. So not providing legal advice, but I'm around later. But I think when I look at that question, I mean, look, we have freedom of contract in this country, right? And the government comes in and puts in laws that restrict that ability, right? You can't do things that are illegal, and you can't do things that violate law. So when I look at this in a financial services context, where my brain goes and the analysis I do is, what are the laws that apply to you, right? And what are the laws that dictate outcomes? If you're outside the scope of a regulated activity, right, and you're left to sort of generalize principles of UDAP or other things that don't prescribe specific conduct or prohibit specific conduct, I think you have a lot more freedom, right? If you're doing an explicitly regulated thing, you're underwriting a credit application and denying someone credit, you have a law that applies, and that's going to tell you have heightened inquiry, and then you have to look also at sort of the outcome. And I think the challenge with AI is that if it wasn't AI, you would look and say, well, does it not have any decision making, and is it a binary, if this, then that? It's just, that's not the nature of AI. That's not what you use AI for. So it makes it a more complicated analysis, because you go and you say, okay, is this regulated conduct? Am I doing a regulated thing, right? If you would like to deploy AI to decide the optimal frequency with which the janitorial services staff cleans your offices, I think you can go for that. Right? I'd have to research the law, of course, to confirm, but go for it. I don't think that's heavily regulated. Then you can decide that frequency. If you're going to start making decisions about consumer credit, who gets a loan modification, who gets a loan, who gets it on what rates, right? What are the decisions that you make? You're entering a regulated space where you have requirements that you have to go through, and it calls for that inquiry. And then there are sort of softer areas, right? Like compliance monitoring and testing of things where they're not a consumer-facing thing. You're using it to flag potential issues and escalate to sort of a human decision maker that's going to go through. I think those are certainly softer areas where, doing sort of back-end QC or testing to make sure things are going the way that they're supposed to do, those are sort of part of financial services, but they're not directly regulated in the way that the content of your truth in lending disclosures are explicitly regulated, right? Where it's just treated differently.
I'll just add one thought on that. The CFPB wrote a paper last year on the use of chatbots in financial services, really building off of complaint data. And one of the sort of like findings from that and things that we say to firms all the time is, really make sure before deploying a technology and consistently reviewing whether or not the technology actually works and what it does, what it's supposed to do. So if your chatbot is lying to people, telling them just completely inaccurate information. Think about whether you would trust a human who was consistently lying to people and telling them incorrect information. And so thinking about whether you would your level of tolerance and trust in a human to do the same thing that you're thinking about technology implementing can be a helpful framework sometimes.
I'm a lawyer too, but this is not legal advice. But the reliability of these LLMs has accelerated so much. Like a year ago, this is probably a different answer. But I think for the most part, these large language models, ChatGPT, Llama, maybe Gemini, I mean, they're good. And so if you have confidence in the application that you've built on this and your developer that's building on this, and you have the ability to go in and audit, one-offs and see, was this right? I think they're better than human right at this point. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a risk-benefit analysis, and the analogy really is with a human. I think culturally and psychically, people are so used to computers always doing the same thing and always giving the right answer, and so they're kind of placed in a different category from people. But really with the AI, it is more like a person in the sense that you can hire a person will do things wrong sometimes. Any person that you hire will do things wrong sometimes. You need to get to know that person and figure out from experience how much trust you can give that person and what kind of tasks it's okay to delegate to them. And then you need to have a model for how you're going to supervise the work of that person. It's similar for AI, right? For some tasks, AI is good. It'll give efficiency and you can manage the risks. For other tasks, the AI is just not that competent and you don't want to manage the risks of letting an AI do that task for you.
All right, thank you all for your perspective, but Johnny is giving us the hook, so we have to wrap this up. Thank you all, and thank you guys for your time.